Hello and welcome to all of you joining us today for our latest webinar. It's titled E-commerce Briefing, Changing Consumer Behaviour and Global Macro Trends. And I'm delighted to say that we are hosting today's webinar jointly with Locate. Now, before we kick off, I'm going to quickly cover a few housekeeping rules. So today's webinar will last about 45 minutes, and this is inclusive of the Q&A session, which I'll help to facilitate if time permits. The webinar is being recorded and we'll be sharing the recording a few days after the live event. When you do receive the recording, feel free to revisit and share it with your colleagues. We also actively encourage any questions throughout the webinar. Please drop them into the question box on screen. I'm actively moderating and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can live on the call. Now, as we move to the next slide, I'm going to be covering the agenda. Today's webinar drills down into global consumer data and the story that tells us across various categories. Beyond just looking at the trends, we'll be asking the question, what can we learn? And that's with the aim of helping to provide you with the foundation to make decisions to help your business in whichever sector you find yourself in. So we've got lots of great content to cover, but before we get started, I'm just going to run a very quick entry poll. So I'm really interested in seeing today, what do you think the business outlook is for you in the tail end of 2020? Are you very optimistic, somewhat optimistic, neutral, somewhat pessimistic, or very pessimistic? I'll give you another quick 20-30 seconds just to put your answers in, and then we will close the poll. Okay, so I can see that 70% of you have voted. I will close the poll in 5 seconds. Good stuff. So very quickly, we have a really interesting breakdown here. So 38% of you are somewhat optimistic, and that is really great to hear. And we'll be sharing some of the key trends today, which should help to instill a little bit more optimism in the e-commerce outlook for many of you on the call. Okay, so let's go back to today's deck. Okay, so I'm going to be introducing these speakers. And I'm virtually alongside today two incredibly knowledgeable senior leaders who between them have detailed insight on the subject matter of e-commerce, retail, and data intelligence. So first of all, we have Alex Timman, who joins me from Amarsis as the SVP Verticals. And I'm equally thrilled to introduce Matt Furno, the Global Commercial Director at Locate. So your first speaker, Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Adam. And it's fantastic to be on your webinar today, and we appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about some of the trends that we're observing. Just 30 seconds on Locate and GBG and why it is that we have some data and some trends to discuss with the audience today. GBG is a global technology company. It helps businesses in more than 70 countries worldwide to reach, identify, and trust their customers. More than 20,000 organizations trust GBG to help them to create safe and successful relationships with their customers. That's really in 3 main areas: location technology, identity technology, and fraud technology. Locate being the location tech brand of GBG, which I'm proud to represent. Fundamentally, Locate technology sits on client websites and is present at the point where a customer typically checks out and completes their order, or perhaps registers for a service. It's that clever bit of tech that completes a postal address in just a few keystrokes and does so accurately for pretty much every country on Earth. So it does something that seems very simple. Under the hood, there's an awful lot of moving parts, but that is trusted by around 15,000 organizations worldwide. And given that very privileged position at the checkout, we're able to observe the sort of trends that right now are really interesting to look at and try and gain some insights from. So who's buying what, where are different sectors thriving, perhaps who is under a little bit more pressure. But given that position that we hold, we're also able to help our customers to recognize that when you create really smooth and simple and efficient customer experiences at the point of checkout particularly, that's going to give you the best chance of converting those customer transactions during what is, by all accounts, a particularly difficult trading period, certainly for some sectors of the market. So we'll come back to some of those points a little bit later on. But that's just a little bit about locate. So given what we're able to observe across such a wide number of customers in a lot of different sectors, of which of course retail is a very important one, we're just going to spend the first few minutes of this webinar sharing what we're seeing, some of the trends that have emerged over the last few weeks. Now, we're located here in the UK, but we're a global business. A lot of our data does emanate from the UK, but we're also able to share data from North America and Central Europe. And we recognise that things haven't all happened in the same cadence. We have some particularly important dates from the UK, particularly the 16th of March, when our Prime Minister told everyone to stay home, but didn't shut any businesses. And then a week later on the 23rd, when all the businesses were shut and everyone was pretty much told to come and work at home. So looking at all of the traffic across the Locate platform, at the end of the process, at checkout or registration, when consumers are filling out a form and then completing their address so as to place their order, what do we see? Well, in the UK, if we start there first, we came out of the New Year sales in our customers in pretty good shape. By the end of February, things were starting to track upwards. I think we had already observed what had gone on in China. I think Italy had already at that point begun to experience the virus in full effect. And we started to see quite an uptick in online traffic. In fact, towards the end of February, some of our customers were seeing volumes that they would normally expect to see around Cyber Monday or Black Friday. So we knew something was up. Across the board, across all 30 different consumer categories that we cover, we then saw across all customers a bit of a downtick leading through to those key dates in the middle of March. But bear in mind, this covers sectors that were going to thrive and sectors that were going to experience more difficulties. And then we see, out of the lockdown announcement, some significant increase in online traffic. I think it's important to say that we try and avoid expressions like winners and losers in this context. This is a critically hard trading situation. And whereas we talk about data, we're all fascinated by data on calls like this, we never forget that we're talking about businesses that employ people. So where sectors are struggling, we see that our friends, our neighbours, our family members might be furloughed or made redundant or experiencing economic hardship. So we take no satisfaction in any of this other than observing. And as Adam said at the outset, what can we participate in the narrative to help organisations to do as best they can during these difficult trading conditions. So what we saw across the board was generally as a category, retail started to perform really well, and Alex is going to go much deeper into that as we go through. Utilities and price comparison websites started to experience really high levels of traffic, certainly as the lockdown kicked in, likely as individuals started to look at how they could manage their personal budgets and home budgets and try and take account of any discounts they could achieve on their utility bills. The charity sector, whilst we know that in some countries charities as a whole, as a sector, are concerned about their income streams. If you're in the UK or you've read the press, you might have read about Captain Tom, 99-year-old British former soldier who's been walking around his garden and raised something like £30 million sterling for the National Health Service. So some of those giving platforms have gone absolutely through the roof in terms of traffic. And online gaming, there's no sports book particularly to bet on, but people at home, perhaps a little bit bored, are participating in opportunities to game online. Clearly the sectors that have struggled, entertainment's an interesting one. Across the piece, it has declined significantly, although at the same time, you may have read about Netflix reporting that they've taken more subscribers in the last 2 months than they did in the whole of the last year. So some sectors of entertainment are clearly thriving. Holiday leisure, sales of cars, and property, all of those we've seen significant declines. But perhaps it's pretty relevant to go a little bit deeper into the retail sector. And again, we're going to a reasonably high level and let Alex go right into the detail. But the areas where consumers have really been moving online with really quite significant increases. And again, we see the upwards trend with those key dates in the middle of March being the pivot points. Home delivery of grocery isn't a thing in every market, we recognise, but in the UK it clearly is. And home delivery of groceries experienced an absolutely enormous uplift as soon as lockdown kicked in. As individuals were being effectively forced to go and work from home, children were home from schools, inevitably we saw a big uptick in the purchase of home electrical goods, whether that was chest freezers for a bit of secret stockpiling, or computer screens, other peripherals to enable individuals to work from home. If you've got young children, we had to entertain them, so we saw toy resellers really starting to experience some high growth. And of course the weather, particularly here in the UK, has been beautiful while we've been stuck at home, so people have been buying things for their home and garden, and sporting goods and other categories have done relatively well, at the expense of often what props up the retail e-commerce sector, that being online apparel, or ladies and men's and footwear, with the exception of sporting footwear. So consumers have been driving the activity that's either determining who's doing well or who's doing less well. If you think about what's happened, this has been a significant economic shock, which we might describe as being from the ground up. The conditions that are COVID-19 have affected people immediately. We might compare and contrast that to 2008 with the banking crisis, where that was really top down as banks were being bailed out. It took a while before consumers started to experience austerity or to experience the effects of that economic shock, but consumers are being affected straight away, and as such are responding straight away. And globally, we saw there in the breakout, the trends are the same. What's interesting is we're seeing that the quarantine, or the lockdown, shelter in place, stay at home orders are producing phases. And I think this is quite an interesting takeaway as we're starting to think, if we are a retailer, what phases come next. And this was just a report that came out from Walmart in the US last week. Slightly light-hearted, but accurate nonetheless. What were the key phases of the lockdown? Well, it would seem that to start with, there were some very practical choices being made, things that were being purchased to keep you safe. And of course, the old toilet paper debate as to why everyone needed to have so much. But as we kind of got into the quarantine, a few luxury items creeping in. I'm not quite sure what the European equivalent of the spiral ham is, but in the US, that was going through the roof. So some comfort purchases being made. Week 4 of the quarantine, or the phase there, suggested that individuals wanted things to do and they were making their own food. And then finally last week, hair care, and that's just an indication that we all need to look after ourselves. And I think finally just some customer experiences, and this will be in the deck to take a look at perhaps after the presentation. But across different parts of the economy, we see different impacts. So not all retailers are experiencing the same thing at the same time. A major US hobby brand, well, they're experiencing absolutely vast traffic because folks are at home with things, nothing to do. So getting into hobbies, we saw a leading auto parts manufacturer and vendor in Europe having to bypass their traditional B2B2C channels because the middle part of that process was starting to suffer with furloughing and shutdowns, and going straight to B2C. And then fashion retailers, of course, suffering from the closure of stores, seeing an uptick online, but not necessarily recognizing that's enough to offset the deficiency. And then finally, a sporting goods firm in the US seeing a third of their annual expected sales in 30 days. So it's not the same for everybody. There are some interesting trends, but I think we should conclude this section by saying consumers are in the driving seat right now with what they want and need. It's good to try and start predicting these phases as we run through this COVID-19 situation. And some businesses are experiencing an unexpected surge in orders, which is stressing their operations. So making sure that you're capturing customer information in a way that you can use that and deliver to your customers and meet their expectations is absolutely critical. So that's probably more time than I've been asked to take, but I'm going to hand over now to Alex to go even deeper into the numbers.
Time well used. I think there's a really important lesson there for a lot of us to be able to have a look at not just the data, but also the context around it. And I think the quote that you left us with is perhaps the most prevalent, which is, we're not living in an age of where businesses are really in control of making people do things. We're living in an age of, now more than ever, consumers are in charge of which brands they engage with and which methods they engage with, and they largely dictate what's going on in the global economy and what's going on with each and every one of our businesses as well. And we are seeing a huge amount of growth in the customers that we're tracking. So across the 2,500 brands that we're working with here at Ecommerce, we have approximately 5 billion consumer profiles across them. Now, obviously, the same person could be buying across multiple brands. So what we've done within our customer data platform is aggregate all of this data, anonymize all of this data to track consumer spending, not brand selling, consumers buying on a global basis. Now, we are not saying that the retail industry is growing by any stretch of the imagination. What we're tracking here is the online sales of multi-channel retailers versus pure e-commerce players. And what is very telling is both in the US, here in Europe, I'm sitting in London as well, and throughout the rest of the world, online sales are booming. But there is a big difference in those growth rates regionally, as this kind of moves in different phases, but most importantly, in terms of categories as well. So orders are definitely rising, revenue is definitely rising, but there are some really important trends that we need to be looking at that help us navigate not just through this current situation, but there will be some really long-lasting trends on digital engagement, e-commerce, and digital commerce as well as we move into the latter half of this year and into 2021 as well. Seems a bit odd to be talking about 2021 in April, but there you go. The first thing is, in addition to a rise in orders and a rise in sales, what we are seeing is actually increases in digital communications. There are more emails being sent, more emails being opened, more emails being clicked than any other time other than in Cyber Week 2019, which was a global record. So if you look at the American Thanksgiving period and the European Cyber Week phenomenon of 2019, it was absolutely huge in terms of sending volumes, but there were some kind of erosions in engagement. What we have seen is more people being housebound and more people being asked to stay at home is increases in sending volumes of brands pushing out communications to both inform their customers as well as to move product, but an increased level of receptiveness from those customers as well in terms of the types of communications they're engaging with. And that's not just for email. We are also seeing a rise in app traffic and also push communications to mobile apps as well, for people who've already got established app programs. Now, we are seeing it being a really tough time for app recruitment. So app downloads are down, but the time in app and also the push communication data as well is actually on the rise as well. So it's not just sales that are on the rise, it's digital engagement with consumers is on the rise as well. And that's, as we can see from that kind of timeline that Matt highlighted, in the UK and also in the US and Germany as well, there were some very, very critical milestones, and we're talking about huge leaps in web traffic and web engagement corresponding to those dates. So as and when the situation changes in certain countries, so North Carolina opens in the US this week. In Germany, stores with a smaller footprint are allowed to start trading again in the retail sector. And in the UK, we've been advised that the next 3 weeks is going to be a continuation of the lockdown. What we are seeing is both globally and regionally, there are some big political statements and big political initiatives that are actually really driving these consumer behaviors. So it's really important to pay attention to what's going on, but most importantly, pay attention to your own traffic that you see and benchmark against other people wherever possible to see how these trends are flowing with these big announcements. Because overwhelmingly, we are seeing each one of these announcements lead to a spike in digital engagement. But as and when there are announcements about things opening over the next couple of weeks as well, what we will be tracking is the rise in offline sales and also comparing, are these increasing digital trends going to hold true as we start seeing more people being able to leave their homes in more spaces. At Ecommerce, we're also really fortunate to be a strategic partner with Facebook, and they had an amazing webinar a couple of weeks back where they were just sharing some data around what they're seeing across the Facebook network. And across Facebook's family of apps, what they are seeing in certain territories and almost exponential increases in WhatsApp, in Messenger, in Instagram, and in Facebook. So they're seeing in areas that are most affected the biggest increases in digital engagement, and they are seeing increases not just in terms of messaging, like Messenger and WhatsApp, but they're seeing almost exponential increases in video calling and live streaming as well, which is a really interesting trend, which we hope to track in the coming months as well. And what is most prevalent and perhaps most interesting about this is there are a lot of people who are going online and making a purchase for the very first time. And if we're looking at the types of people who are going online and the types of people who are actually engaging with social and digital channels, there's a really, really interesting mix of people where there's often a lot of focus on millennials and the millennial generation. But the fact that we're all sitting here on GoToWebinar, and I'm sure everyone on this call has had a Zoom call at some point in the last 3 or 4 weeks, that's a really, really telling sign. Because it isn't just happening to us, it's happening across generations. So for the very first time, we've got a very, very large increase in the digital population, and it's not just coming from a new generation coming in, it is coming from some established patterns of behavior within different generations, really shifting towards the digital realm, but not just shifting towards engagement and buying things, but it's switching towards engagement and viewing things and consuming content, which I think is going to be a really interesting and important trend for all of us to keep an eye on. And that's really brought home by some of the examples of businesses that are in fortunate sectors that are doing quite well and are moving and capitalizing on these types of trends to be able to really pivot and lean into what is effectively an enforced digital transformation. And if you look at some of the cosmetics brands, we're fortunate enough to work with a large number of cosmetics brands, but also for luxury retailers and department stores like Harvey Nichols as well. They're all embracing similar kind of techniques. And one of these techniques is to utilize the expertise and the hands-on service they used to providing in stores virtually. So we're seeing a rise of augmented reality, but also people hacking augmented reality, like Mecca Cosmetics in Australia, where they literally just made sure that everyone with an iPhone was available to make FaceTime calls. It's a really, really simple thing to do, to say, if I have experts that have an opinion or a service to provide and I can't do that in person, what can I do to make sure that that's digitally enabled, knowing that there's an upward trend of people being more comfortable with video and video calling. So what they have been able to do is to embrace some of these trends and really unlock new opportunities for their business, which I'm sure will actually lead to not just new customers and new services right now, but actually change the way that their business operates as and when things open back up as well. And for Charlotte Tilbury, they received a lot of press over the last 2 years for the digital mirrors that they provide in their stores that allow you to look at the different shades of lipstick, eyeshadow, and cosmetics in store. They've made that service available online as well through a mobile application. So we are seeing cosmetics being up by 50% in Europe. It's up even higher in Southeast Asia in terms of online sales. This isn't replacing the huge gap in offline sales. It's offline sales of cosmetics are by far and away the biggest driver in that industry. But this shift towards digital and this shift towards online will be a really, really telling change on consumer behavior. And it'll be very important to see how this translates into engagement in other verticals as things progress as well. I think Matt had a few comments and a few kind of course you can.
Yeah, sorry, just on the last slide, we talked about Charlotte Tilbury. Just one of our observations in discussions with our customers are those that have had to, if they've got high street presence, obviously have had to shutter that, and even ones that have not been able to continue their online operations. We're just seeing some really good examples of where brands are maintaining the relationship with customers through social, keeping a web presence, keeping the conversation going, keeping that personalization going, even if there's no transactions. And I think one of the things is we all try and figure out what does, we look back at what we thought was normal. We're in the new normal. What does the new normal look like? But I think to have the best chance of getting a fast start out of the blocks, even if you're a brand that's had to actually cease trading altogether, maintaining that relationship with customers, keeping that personalization going, even without transactions, we're seeing some really great examples of that.
I think it's a really great point, and what we have seen is for some clients like Sally Beauty, who are in the beauty industry, but mainly providing their services to small independent artists and hairstylists, they've had to just close up shop completely. And what they're worried about is, what does it mean to my customers and what does it mean to a really loyal customer base when I reopen? And their director of loyalty was saying, look, I don't know what world I'm walking into right now. It's how can I figure out whether I'm just picking up where I left off? Do I have to win back customers? And do I have to engage with them in a different way because they've been acclimatized to a new normal, as you say? And I think that's one of the really important points of all of this, is that not every business is in the same position, but consumers are changing and businesses are changing at a rate that's never really happened before. I think as we move on to the next slide, I think one of the key things as well for different sectors is mid-market fashion's being massively under pressure. I think if we look at the overall timeline, this dip here doesn't look huge, but this is just of online orders. When we take into account offline orders as well, which for a lot of businesses are accounting for, in the case of Oasis, who recently had to file for administration, 70% of their revenue happens offline in physical stores, and those stores are just not trading. So what we did see was a big spike and a big rebound in mid-market fashion over the Easter period. Why? Absolutely no idea. Can't actually figure out why people were buying a lot more fashion since that period, but it did coincide with a big uptick that's hopefully going to help a lot of retailers get that additional cash flow to keep trading. But what we are seeing is that for a lot of these mid-market fashion retailers, the amount of money that they're losing from their physical store trade just simply cannot be replicated in 2 or 3 months from their online, even if it is in slight growth. So we are seeing rocket ship growth since the Easter period, but how long that will hold and how long that will actually kind of put enough in the coffers to keep some of these businesses trading until things reopen is a really, really telling sign, which is why we see a lot of pressure in Germany and in the US on the government to reopen retail, simply because it doesn't have the finances or the balance sheet to be closed for business to 3 to 6 months. And if we go into some of the areas that are in absolute growth, then what we have seen in Italy is that while it's been one of the countries most affected by COVID-19, their luxury sector has actually seen a huge boom in online sales, and we've actually seen Italy's growth in terms of e-commerce be phenomenally strong. It's there's always some stories that are really difficult to deal with, and the human element of what's going on is by far and away the most important to bear in mind. But there are really industries that have been hard hit, and there are other industries that are seeing a boom. This is also representative of the types of customers are buying and how those types of customers are being affected. And for people who are making luxury purchases, they tend to be in jobs that are less likely to be furloughed and less likely to be experiencing problems for now. But sooner or later, the longer that this goes on, the bigger effect it's going to have on almost every sector of the economy. So luxury fashion and accessory brands are showing really, really strong signs of uptick. And when a flagship luxury store reopened in China, they made $2.5 million in a day from a single luxury fashion store. So luxury is a sector that's very much on the rise digitally, but it's been relatively well insulated from the situation that we find ourselves in currently. But what's also a little bit less apparent is for everyone who's been told to stay indoors, there's been a huge increase in sportswear. Whether it's for people actually just investing in loungewear to be sitting around in a house versus other elements has been open to debate. But what we have seen is not just an increase in people buying loungewear, but we have seen an increase in sports shoes. We've seen an increase in exercise equipment, and we've seen even an increase in treadmills and stationary bikes, all for people who are becoming a little bit more health conscious as and when these things go on. They just want something to do. And I think global sportswear, we're lucky enough to work with Puma, New Balance and Nike. They've all reported strong trading conditions, and for Sports Direct in the UK as well, their online stores have also been weathering the storm pretty well. But if you are any of these brands, the amount of money that they're not making in their physical stores is absolutely astronomical. We're talking about billions in revenue that isn't happening in stores right now, but there is a small bright spot of offsetting that, which is strong demand in their online and strong growth in their online, where Nike have actually said this year they're actually going to be trading up, even despite not being able to sell through their retail channels. So direct-to-consumer sales for Nike mean that they're not actually forecasting any real negative financial results right now. But as and when things change in the global economy, obviously no one can never say never, but it is encouraging to see that in this athletic wear sector, there's been a huge switch, a huge change in consumer behavior in a very, very short space of time. And
I think just off the back of that, Alex, sorry, we can't do hand gestures, can we? Interesting piece in the FT 2 days ago, again about Nike. that they've announced that I think around 80% of their stores in China have now reopened. So they're almost back up to full kind of high street trading capacity in China, which just gives us a little glimpse, I think, into the future. We might come back to that as to what does a market look like that's gone through this cycle and has in some shape or form come out the other end. And I think the example of Nike is hopefully a possible piece of good news, that there could be a bit of positivity on the horizon for the high street that can reopen, that we're seeing such a large brand sort of getting back up to speed relatively quickly.
I think it's a really important point, and I think it's a fantastic observation. Thanks for sharing that. I think it's true of a lot of brands that are already in the ascendancy. I think the rise in sportswear is probably not going to be equally good for everyone. If you're just trying to get into the sportswear game and just shipping it and your brand isn't already established, it's probably going to be a lot more difficult than for those that are actually already well established and already have big communities. And one of the things that we have seen from some of these brands that are in growth, so Nike is a great example, is they have a huge social community, they have a huge brand, but they also have sponsorship and also owned properties in almost every sporting category. So whether it's their running app, or whether it's Nike Fuel for body counting, or whether it's the activewear brands as well, everything's all linked together to an existing community. Building a community is probably going to be very difficult right now. But there are opportunities that can be exploited, and there's some great advice from two entrepreneurs from a fantastically well-run business in the UK called Gymshark, who has managed to make it to more than 300 million in revenue from initially starting a screen printing t-shirts in a garage to being an international brand and one of Shopify's biggest clients in the world. There's a fantastic quote about what they've been able to do to get themselves to be one of the most trafficked brands on Instagram in this sports apparel wear, and what they've been able to do to capitalize on this growth, not just in the UK, but the US growth has been really encouraging as well. Their CMO and their chief brand officer, pictured here, their chief brand officer openly said, look, for myself and Ben Francis, we aren't genius marketers. We're just good listeners. We listen to our audience and we act on what they think, what we think they want. That's pretty much it. And I think it's back to Matt's point at the beginning that consumers are largely dictating a lot of these trends. So it's about how do we spot and analyze the trends that your brand can more quickly lean into and also capitalize upon, rather than trying to artificially create any trends for yourself and kind of force the issue upon a customer. It's about now more than ever listening to customer data and listening to signals to figure out what are the opportunities for you and what are the opportunities for your business as you move forward as well, which I think it's a great quote and a great observation. And just as we start to tie things up, one of the other things that we're looking at here in this really difficult to understand graphic, which I apologize for already, is the colors that are represented here. The darker the color represents the more brands that people are buying from internationally. So where we have a very dark blue color, it means that there's a greater proportion of international brands selling to consumers in those territories. Where you see a lighter color, it means people are more reliant upon domestic brands. Why this is really important is there are a lot of brands that are joining this call that are international, and they are selling cross-border in 5, 6, 7, or 10 different geographies. One of the biggest trends that we've been able to help work with across our clients is which countries are open for business and how is that affecting online sales as well as offline sales. So what we are looking at really closely is trends in Germany, trends in the US as things start reopening, but also trends in Australia and New Zealand have been really, really erratic as well, because the government's been controlling the types of products that people can actually buy and the types of products that brands can sell to manage their capacity, because everything needs to be imported. And those are the types of decisions that are made by companies and made by governments and made by brands that are really, really difficult to track, but are really, really important to keep a pulse on, to say, if you are trading in 5 markets that are proportionally responsible for your revenue, our instinct is to pay a great amount of attention to those brands. But for some of our clients, we've seen an uptick in countries like Sweden, where they weren't potentially paying a huge amount of attention before. But Sweden's one of the few countries that hasn't had a great amount of negative press domestically around COVID-19 and has remained largely open for business and kind of responsible in their policies of recommending social distancing but not enforcing it. And it's actually led to an increase in e-commerce activity for a number of fast fashion brands and sportswear brands to online customers in Sweden. So these things are very, very difficult, if not nigh on impossible, to forecast and predict. So it's really about being agile in your decision making, to look at your overall trading environment, not just the domestic policy making the decisions, but where your customers are and how your customers are behaving can help us find and hopefully act upon some new opportunities in the coming months as well. And just as we move on to the last kind of slide, one of the things we're doing here at Ecommerce as well is across our clients, we're fortunate to track tens of millions of products in terms of their availability, and in terms of their price, and in terms of their sell-through rates. And we're launching on the CC Insights website, that's ccinsights.org, a new visualization from next week that's going to show us a little bit more about the products that are in the ascendancy, so products that are accelerating in terms of year-on-year growth, but also products that are decelerating. And I think it just echoes what Matt said at the beginning about categories that are in growth, is what we are seeing slowing down right now is exercise equipment. So yoga mats, Swiss balls, stationary bikes and treadmills, year on year, have been going great guns. But that's now starting to taper off as reality is setting in, and certain things are potentially going back open to business, and things are switching to a little bit more lighthearted in nature. The weather's also changing. So I appreciate a lot of these products would have been sold anyway, but they wouldn't necessarily have been sold online. So what we're looking at here is a year-on-year increase in 268% in barbecues, and 305% in hammocks, and 227% in lawnmowers. And these are being sold in orders of more than 10,000 units a day. So very, very high volumes of products that would traditionally be bought potentially in stores, in DIY centers, or in specialist stores are now being bought online. And it's also hopefully a positive sign of consumer sentiment, where people aren't buying dried goods and things are battening down the hatches to say how do we weather a recession, but they're buying things for friends and family and to be able to keep themselves entertained, make best use of their back gardens, and hopefully make the best use of both the British weather and the American weather as it holds. And then if we just move on to the next piece, then I think we're ready for wrap-ups, and I think maybe a brief exit poll as well.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Matt. All right, sounds good. So let's jump into the exit poll. And this one is a little bit more tactical, and we're looking to ask you, which channels are you using to stay in touch with your customers? Is it your website, your phone, or rather phone-based channels such as SMS and push, email, direct mail, or social media? And this is a multiple choice, multiple options question. So again, I expect many of you out there will be communicating across various channels at this time, as with any other time. So I can see the responses are coming in. We're just coming up for 50% of you having submitted your answers. I'll give you another 10 seconds just to wrap up the responses before I share the results. Okay, and we'll be closing the poll. So as you can see, it looks like many of you are using email, which also corresponds to the earlier data visualization that Alex showed earlier, with the higher numbers of emails being sent, as well as the number of email engagements you're likely receiving. So that's no surprise there. It's also interesting to see the amount of activity that's happening on social media. And again, I think that's primarily because we're seeing, because of some of the stats that we've seen from Facebook, that engagements and actual sort of activity on social media platforms is also increasing. So really interesting results there, and thank you very much for sharing.
Just a quick one on that as well, Adam. I think one of the points that you raised as well is really interesting, which is when we're talking about social media, there's a difference between organic and brand activity and paid activity. And what we are seeing is that ad revenue for Facebook and Google is falling. A lot of brands are spending a lot less money on ads right now, given the uncertainty in the economic climate and how ad spend is driven largely by consumer packaged goods and retail. They're often the biggest spenders, followed by travel. That money's kind of dried up a little bit right now in advertising, but we are seeing a social engagement higher than ever before. And similarly for direct mail and SMS, the more expensive channels on a kind of cost per thousand basis, those are ones where people are being a bit more careful about their spending decision. what would be very interesting is, because trading's so high and because people are at home and are likely to be so in some markets for an extended period of time, what knock-on impact and what knock-on effect will that have on channel mix and attribution is going to be a really, really interesting thing for people to look at, because we are seeing a lot of orders and a lot of sales without spending on direct mail, SMS, and ads. But does that mean that those channels aren't effective, or is that just really a sign of the trading environment? I definitely think it's a sign of the trading environment, but I think a lot of brands are going to be making some really tough decisions as to when to turn back on those channels and when to turn back on the tap in terms of ad revenue, in terms of how they fuel their customer engagement strategies to really drive business value.
Some great points there, Alex, and thank you for adding that extra flavour to that. I think, you know, the context behind the numbers is always really important, and that's obviously what we've tried to do throughout this presentation for those of you watching. So looking at the time, I think we've got a bit of time for maybe a couple of questions before we run through the key takeaways and next steps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fire the question to you, Alex, and then if you'd like to obviously provide some insight and then pass the ball over to Matt to add his flavour as well. The first question that's come through from Dimitri is, are there any predictions on how durable the consumer behavioural changes will be?
Only from foolish people, I would say. I think that making predictions in the current climate is a very, very risky game. And as you alluded to at the beginning of the call, I've been in this game a long time. There is a little bit of grey in my beard, but how people are reacting and what people are buying and how consumer confidence is being affected by this situation is so difficult to even keep track of, never mind predict. So I think I am more seriously expecting some long-lasting changes in the digital habits of people. So how they consume information and how they engage with brands, I do think is going to be fundamentally changed by the period that we're going through. How long that lasts, what the long-term implications are, and how people should actually adapt their strategy behind it. It's only realistically been 3 weeks worth of really meaningful data, and the world has not yet returned from this new normal to a new normal, as Matt put it. So I think it's I'd be very, very reticent to make any predictions, but I'm definitely going to say something's going to change. I just don't know what, which is the worst possible fluffy answer to a very serious question.
Yeah, we'll go on then. I'll challenge accepted, Dimitri. I'll make a prediction, and we'll check back in 6 months and see where we are. I think Alex alluded to this in a slide earlier on around demographic behaviour, what we might call sort of Generation Zoom. You know, some of us have got parents in their 80s that we've got onto a Zoom call, and they're using technology that they never would have dreamt of using. So my prediction is that the kind of the total addressable online market obviously is expanding enormously during these different times, but I think when it starts to contract back again with the opening of a large proportion of the high street presence, although not all, I think that addressable online market will be bigger than it was when we came in. So, and I think it'll be bigger because there will be parts of those demographic groups that are just never wanted to participate with e-commerce before. To that extent, I think it's going to be required of online retailers to be ready for that and to make sure it's simple for that older generation or that less tech savvy generation to be active online. You know, make it easy to pay, make it easy to find what you want, make it easy to check out. Something as simple as just entering your address, make it really, really simple for those groups that I think they'll stick with it, you know, because they'll find it convenient. And maybe for a year or more, there might be part of that demographic which simply don't want to be going out and still practicing social distancing, either because of particular health concerns or just worries. So that's my prediction. I think the online cohort that we can go to and we can serve is going to be much bigger, but we've got to make it easy for them.
I think that's a great point to end on. I think that now more than ever, I think it's that one bit of good news and that one bit of certainty is things have changed fundamentally, and I think that's a great way of kind of looking at the opportunity, but also looking at the challenge, Matt, is to say, look, our online population has just grown exponentially through a forced event on a global scale. How brands respond to this is going to be increasingly about how they look at those consumer trends and how they adapt to them, just to make sure that they're linking what their customers are looking for with what their business is looking for and adapting their marketing strategies accordingly. So I think that's the time for today. Really enjoyed the session, and thanks to Matt for providing so many insights at such short notice. It's really appreciated. I learned a lot today, and I'm sure a lot of the other people there did as well. And Adam, if you just want to give some follow-ups to people as to how they can find Locate and how they can find Ecommerce, it would be fantastic to make sure that people leave with a clear next step.
Absolutely will do, yeah. I'm sure many of you are keen to get to your next meeting or dash across for a bit of lunch, whatever it may be. So your next steps, so we highly recommend that you head on over to ccinsight.org, where you can find many of these insights for yourself. We've obviously created this resource at Ecommerce along with good data to enable you to have these insights at your fingertips. You can also get the latest e-commerce and retail news and trends on ccinsight.org, as well as viewing that some of the data and graphics that we've shown today by heading over to the content sections. What we're doing is curating the best of e-commerce and retail insights there, so you can consume them at your leisure. Of course, also feel free to reach out to Ecommerce and Locate. Head on over to ecommerce.com and reach out to us via the contact us form. And the same goes for Locate as well. So head on over to the Locate website and reach out and speak to one of our experts in-house, and we'll be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Just for those of you that did ask a question today as well, and we didn't get round to responding to it in person, we have received your question and we'll aim to respond to you after the session. So as Alex said, a big thank you to Matt from me, a thank you to Alex, and a thank you to all of you out there for attending today. We look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. We have one next week on Thursday, the 30th of April, and that's also with Alex, as well as Ross Williams, a former B2C professional, now VP Retail at Ecommerce. And we'll be covering how to turn customer, product, and sales data into new revenue opportunities fast. We'll be sharing that link as well as the other links mentioned on today's call in the follow-up email. Thanks again for your time.